Terang bulan dikali, buaya timbul disangkalah mati. Jangan percaya mulutlah lelaki, berani sumpah tapi takut mati. Jangan percaya mulutlah lelaki, berani sumpah tapi takut mati.
Good afternoon to everyone who's in Hawaii. Good evening to those friends of ours on the mainland US, and good morning to everyone in Southeast Asia. It's our great pleasure today to welcome you to our first event in our fall 2025 Loose Southeast Asia Transition Series. It couldn't come at a more timely date as the US government just shut down today. But it's my pleasure actually to welcome colleagues both at the University of Hawaii and elsewhere to join us in an important and very timely conversation. Today, we'll be talking about Southeast Asia facing the US tariff turbulence, and we've got some experts in the field to work with us on this. I wanted to first, on behalf of the Luce Foundation, express our gratitude for the support we've been getting for many years from the Luce Foundation, and also to everyone who both has joined us today and who's participating. We encourage you to ask questions. As we go along, at the end, we'll have question and answer, but we may have a nice period of time for that. And then I would like to turn the baton over to Dr. Micah Fisher, who is at the University of Hawaii in the Matsunaga Institute of Peace, and he will be our moderator. It's a pleasure to see you all here, and I look forward to all the insights you can give us about what we might expect in the next little while. Best wishes. Bye-bye.
Aloha, everyone. My name is Micah Fisher. Thanks for the kind introduction, Dr. Stark. And I'm really, really excited to welcome you all as the moderator for today's webinar, Southeast Asian Facing the U.S. Tariff Turbulence. This webinar explores how Southeast Asian states are responding to the economic, political, and social impacts of U.S. tariff policies. We're going to examine the ripple effects of global trade shifts on ASEAN economies, including the ongoing decline of the middle class across member states. The session also analyzes both the national and regional political responses, highlighting ASEAN's role as a regional mechanism in mitigating these challenges. Additionally, what we'll be doing today is addressing how U.S. tariffs affect Southeast Asian countries operating within the American market. As Dr. Stark mentioned at the outset, this is incredibly timely, not just for the U.S., but relations with ASEAN and vice versa. And I'm really, really excited to welcome a wonderful panel of experts and speakers to today's presentation. I will just give a brief introduction of their titles and their presentations, and I will try to get off the screen as quickly as possible so we can hear directly from the expert. First, we have Dr. Jayant Menon, visiting senior fellow at the ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute in Singapore. He'll be talking about Trump trade policy and the likely impacts on Southeast Asia. Next, we'll have Herawati, who is a researcher at the Habibie Center in Indonesia, talking about the exposure and dependence, ASEAN's export risks under U.S. reciprocal tariff pressures. Finally, we'll have Dr. Tung Bui, a professor at the University of Hawaii at Mānoa, a good friend of us here at the UH Center for Southeast Asian Studies, and he will be talking about how the effects of the tariffs are playing out for Southeast Asian countries in the U.S. market. Without further ado, I'm honored to be able to introduce our speakers and look forward to an excellent discussion with you all. Dr. Jayant Menon, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Micah. And let me start by thanking the center and all of you for having me. It's a great honor and a pleasure. I have a set of slides that I will try and share now. Hopefully you can see them in a minute. Please tell me if you can't. Yeah. Hopefully you can see this.
Looks great. Perfect. It's
great.
in presentation mode. Go ahead.
Oh, great. Yeah. So as Mika just mentioned, I'll be talking about the likely impacts of the tariffs on Southeast Asia. I'll start very quickly with some basic details about the tariffs. I think you all know about this. So I won't spend much time. And then provide a bit of background information on Southeast Asian tariffs and trade. Then I want to move on to the crux of the presentation, which is the four options, in my view, facing exporters to the US in light of the current tariffs. And then I want to finish off by looking at some short and long-term effects of Trump's tariffs. Okay, so let me get started. This is the only equation I'll be showing you today. I think you might have seen it. It's what the Trump administration used to come up with the original so-called reciprocal tariffs announced on Liberation Day, 2 April. There's nothing to do with reciprocal barriers. So I think I prefer to call them bilateral adjusted deficit share tariffs, or BAD tariffs is the acronym. And it's basically a function of the bilateral deficit that the US is running, but it's adjusted in a number of ways. It's arbitrarily divided by 2. There's a base minimum of 10%, even if they run a surplus. And it's also excludes services. It's only goods. Of course, these were the original rates, and for Southeast Asia, this is what it looked like. It was one of the hardest hit of the original so-called reciprocal tariffs, but they changed very quickly to what they are today. And you can see here that they are all lower, some of them quite a bit lower, some of them just a little bit lower. Laos and Myanmar, two of the poorest countries going through political and economic crises, have the highest rate of 40%. Most of the others are around 20%. But Singapore has the lowest because they actually have US has a surplus with them. So they get the minimum base rate of 10. Yeah, so these are the current rates. And in this picture, you can see the 2014 US trade balance in dollars with each of the Southeast Asian countries, or I should say ASEAN countries, because I haven't included Timor-Leste. They're not a member of ASEAN yet. Vietnam has the largest deficit, and is the one country where the US is actually concerned about the size of the deficit because it's large enough to matter to them in aggregate sense. But to highlight how the current tariffs are somewhat arbitrary, you can see that some of the highest tariffs Laos, Myanmar, and Brunei. Laos, Myanmar, 40%, Brunei, 25%. Of course, Singapore's got surplus, so it's 10%. But Laos, Myanmar, and Brunei have the lowest dollar deficits as far as the US is concerned, but they have the highest tariffs. So, any kind of economic rationale or logic is out the window when it comes to setting of these tariffs. Some countries offered a lot and didn't get much of a reduction. Some countries didn't offer very much and they got a reduction, and vice versa. So it's all over the place, but this is how it is and where we are. Just to put it in comparative context, where do these Southeast Asian countries fit in with the rest of the world? Of course, China runs the biggest surplus with the US at almost 300 billion, followed by the European Union, which is not a country, but a group of 26 or so countries. Then Mexico, but Vietnam is there, number 4. So this is what I said earlier about how it's significant.
Okay, I think in the interest of time, why don't we continue the conversation? Ibu Herawati, can you share your screen and we can begin the presentation? If, for example, if Jayant logs back in, we can come back to the remainder of this presentation after you finish. Okay?
All right, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me share my presentation first. Yep. Sorry. Just can you see it clearly, my presentation?
Can you put it into the presentation mode?
All right. Sorry about
Excellent.
that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and good afternoon for colleagues in Hawaii. Thank you so much for this opportunity to talk with other distinguished speakers. It's truly an honor to be here with all of the speakers. So for today's presentation, I would I would like to talk about exposure and dependence to see ASEAN export risk under the U.S. reciprocal tariff pressure. So as what Jayant Menon said, for this presentation, I would focus on the export on goods, and then because as what I said previously, it's reciprocal tariff for this time. It's a focus on the export on goods. Oh, excuse me. Can you see my presentation?
Yeah, it's still on the title slide. Can you go to the next slide?
Yeah, I tried to. No,
Maybe the arrow at the bottom.
Yeah. All right.
Excellent.
So there are like 4 points that I want to highlight for this presentation. The first one is why the U.S. matters for ASEAN, because like why this reciprocal tariff become like a big problem for ASEAN export. And then in order to see that, I would show it in the country level exposure and vulnerabilities. And then I would like to, after that, I'll try to see the potential impacts to the ASEAN economies, specifically in the trade. And then after that, to sum up my discussion, I would like to kind of provide some recommendation for ASEAN. Yeah, so this is the export-import value from ASEAN to the US in 2023 and 2024. As we can see, during this period, let's say like 20 years, 15 years from now, ASEAN has been applying this some sort of export kind of oriented, and then ASEAN, the US become ASEAN and the US has like a large bilateral trade volume. And then the US is one of the ASEAN top trading partners. So in 2024 itself, the trade in goods reached around 453.4 billion. And then if you compare to other countries, the US is a major destination for ASEAN export. So in the next slide, we will see like how US and China become the two largest market export for ASEAN, and then usually the share of the export is around 15% each year. And then if we see the sectoral dependence, it's like there are so many like high dependency on the electronical machinery and also the labor intensive manufacture. And then as what Jayant Menon said before, there is this trade balance gap. The trade balance with the ASEAN and the US, where export to the US from ASEAN is very high, and then it's kind of it has like very high gap if we compare to the import, as you can see in the graph. And oops, yep, I think it's still like working on the data. Okay, so this data actually I want to show like how the export of goods from ASEAN to top 20 largest partner. As you can see, in 2024, it was United States become like the first largest trading partner, and in 2023 we have China. And I don't know, can you see the picture here? Because I can't really see. So
We
it's
do
in
see the
2000.
circles.
Yeah, I think the data is a bit big in size, so it's still there. But what I want to emphasize here that United States has become like one of the major trading partner for ASEAN for like at least a recent year, and also like the year before COVID-19. And this is like the country level exposure and vulnerability. So if we see the percentage of US of export from ASEAN to US GDP, we can see that each ASEAN member state has different level of exposure and vulnerability to the US market. And from the data, we can see that the Cambodia and Vietnam, they have like high exposure. It's like more than 20% of their export go to the US. And then it means that they have like extremely reliant on US export, and then strong dependency on US market. And then if we see from the data, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Thailand, it's in medium exposure. It's between 10 or 19.9%. And then they are moderately vulnerable, but if we see from the magnitude of the economy, I mean the GDP, then it's kind of like quite serious for them. And then for the low exposure, it's less than 10%. We have the Brunei Darussalam is very low, and Laos PDR and Myanmar, that's also very low. And then they are also low in the kind of economic size. But if we see Indonesia and Singapore, actually they are like near medium exposure, but because of their economy is quite big, so the magnitude of this exposure is also like bigger compared to Brunei, let's say, Laos and Myanmar. And Singapore, it's like 8.5%. It's despite of high trade openness. We can see that in Singapore, export are widely diversified, and then they have like low vulnerability. And then given the 10% of tariff that the base tariff that they have, I think they're still in kind of safe position in this kind of reciprocal tariff. And then, sorry about the title. But if we see from the product category, ASEAN export to the US actually are highly concentrated and vulnerable. We have kind of, ASEAN have heavy reliance on the tech or industrial goods and cost-sensitive labor sector. As we can see here, the electrical machinery and the machinery part, it's count almost half of the export. So any turbulence, any shift on the tariff on this kind of a product will, of course, impact ASEAN. And then for the textile, like furniture, footwear, and textile, it's almost like 25%. So this is labor intensive and cost sensitive kind of product. So we can see that it is highly concentrated, and then this reciprocal tariff can be like potentially impact this kind of product, the export of this product. And then the next slide. So I want to see like how like the concentration of the product in every country. So as we see before, for Brunei Darussalam and then Laos PDR and Myanmar, they kind of tend to have like small percentage of export to US. But if we look into Cambodia, they are like heavy reliance on the clothing kind of export to the US. And for Indonesia, beside the electrical machinery, we also export like clothing to the US. And if you see here for the apparels and then footwear, it count like 28% of the export. So any change of this product will actually decrease the demand for Indonesian kind of clothing to the US. And then if we see Malaysia, it's more like electrical machinery, and then it count like almost 70%, 80% of their export to the US. And then seems like the Philippines, the electrical machinery and the machinery kind of cover around 65 of the export. And also for Singapore, they also have like high reliance on the electrical machinery and also optical and medical kind of machine. And then for Thailand, it's almost the same like the Singapore, heavy reliance on the electrical machinery and also the vehicles. The vehicles count for like 4.25% of their export to the US. And then the Vietnam, it's interesting because they both have this clothing and also the electrical machinery and machinery to the US. And then here how I try to kind of see the potential implication to ASEAN member state based on their the reliance on the export to the US based on the product category. So for Vietnam and Cambodia, they are most exposed to labor-intensive tariff shock due to heavy reliance on apparel and footwear. And also we see also Vietnam, they also have heavy reliance on the machinery. So the apparel, and the footwear, they are very price sensitive. And then if there is an increase of price in the US, it will face immediate demand decline under the tariff. And then because it's like heavy reliance on the clothing, it means that they usually use like labor intensive, and then the social impact that can happen is in a clothing industry, there are large employment of women and informal workers. So if there is like reduce in demand, and then if the company reduce the productivity level, it means that there are some women and informal worker will get impact of this kind of tariff. And then there is also supply chain risk, and there's the potential relocation to non-ASEAN supplier to kind of find for the company to find a place where the tariff is not as high as what we have in ASEAN. And then for the technology intensive, like Malaysia, Thailand, and the Philippines, they are more vulnerable to technology relative tariff. And then it's affecting the electronical and machinery value chain. So the tariff can disrupt complex cross-border production network, and then it's also can rise the product prices and also reduce the competitiveness. In the investment effect, the uncertainty may defer FDI into higher tax manufacturing to kind of reduce the price of the this technology intensive kind of product. And then for capital intensive, like Singapore, Indonesia, and Brunei, face fewer but potentially more disruptive impact in capital and heavy industry sector. And then they have lower exposure but high stakes. Large value project and heavy equipment contract could be delayed or canceled. And then long-term risk, tariffs reduce incentive for capital intensive investment. So I think, as I said before, like each ASEAN member state has different kind of potential impact toward the reciprocal tariff. And then it's also depend on the what kind of product are they rely on. And to finish my presentation, I would say that ASEAN export exposure to the US varies across the country. And then if ASEAN countries continue to depend heavily on export to the US without strategic measure, their economies remain at risk, and then sudden shift can actually be like a big problem for the country. So I have like try to give a recommendation here. And as like if we remember, like the first time we learned from economy, we learned about don't put your eggs in one basket. So ASEAN actually need to diversify export market. And then from the data before, we could also see that ASEAN still have like opportunity to increase their export to intra-ASEAN trade. So kind of shift their kind of export focus not only to the US, but also to intra-ASEAN trades. And then also to the BRIC countries, as we know that some of ASEAN countries just start to join BRICS country. And then also like Indonesia just recently have this kind of economic partnership with the EU. So I think there's still like a need for ASEAN to diversify the export market. And then the second one is collective action. ASEAN need to strengthen their position in trade negotiation, even though ASEAN, it's not, it doesn't work like EU when like they can do actually economic action with like all of the country, but ASEAN, some country, they have their own interest, and then it's what they do to respond to the Trump tariff, usually like bilateral kind of negotiation. I think move forward, ASEAN can kind of strengthen the coordination and then make the negotiation kind of more benefit to ASEAN. And then also there's like strategic for the product category. So ASEAN need to kind of make the price more competitive in order to enter the US market. And then there is need of this investment and production regional integration in ASEAN. And then for the technology intensive kind of product category, ASEAN need to promote more of research and development and also expand access to the tech market. I think I'll stop there, and thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Ibu Herawati. That's a really, really far-ranging set of topics. I really appreciated the points about the commodities as well as the trade terms, the implications for labor, and I really look forward to having a conversation about this in the Q&A. I just want to remind folks who are in attendance to please ask questions throughout. We're going to compile them and use them as a basis to have a facilitated discussion at the end. But it's really interesting hearing this presentation with Jayant's initial sort of framing about these issues. It kind of works nicely to have this in conversation in a reflexive way with one another. So I want to give it back to Jayant to pick up where we left off. Especially as you were talking about those indicators. I think this works really well, actually. Go ahead. Floor is yours.
Absolutely, yes. Again, my apologies. I'm actually in Manila at the moment, and power outages are not uncommon, although this is the first time this week it's happened while I've been here. But hopefully I will see it through without any further interruption. And I'll just go back to my slides. But plus, as you said, Micah, is that I got to hear what Hera had to say, and I think it does dovetail quite nicely in terms of what what I had said before I was suddenly kicked out, which was the context, the background of how these countries sat next to each other and with the rest of the world. And I think I'll highlight some of the points that Hera has already raised, which is things like diversifying trade patterns and so on. But I think I was here before I left you, just comparing where the ASEAN countries sat next to the rest of the world. And Vietnam was fourth, coming after China, EU, and Mexico. And Thailand is number 10, Malaysia, Indonesia, 12 and 13, and so on. So Southeast Asia is important to the US, but the US is generally more important to Southeast Asia. So that's something to bear in mind. So very quickly, we see the headline rates for countries, but they mask a lot of variation across products. To highlight that point, this is just one example of the rates on China. Of course, China, the negotiations are paused for the second time now. But before that, this is, you can see what the rates are, and there's stacking going on where earlier rates, like the rates that were introduced under Trump 1.0, are still there. And the new rates come on top of them. And there's a host of sectoral and other rates. And you can see here the variations are indeed quite significant across products. So even though we look at the country rates, underneath the country rates is a lot of variation across products. Okay, so let me get into the crux of the presentation and what I see as the four broad options facing Southeast Asian, indeed any exporter to the US in light of these tariffs. The first option, of course, is to simply pass on or pass through the tariff to the US importer, and thereby leaving export prices unchanged. The second is to absorb some or all of the tariffs by reducing their export prices so that US consumer prices don't rise by the full or even some amount of the tariff. The third is to respond by reconfiguring supply chains to minimize the tariffs that you face in the US. I'll go into a bit more detail in a minute. And finally, is to reduce or remove exposure to the tariffs by diversifying or switching markets. So this is, I think, pretty comprehensive. I think they're all the options facing exporters, but they're not mutually exclusive. So you can have a combination of the four, and there's always a product and a time dimension associated with each of the options. But all four options involve costs of one kind or another, and there's no escaping that. Okay, so let me get into each option with a bit more detail. So the first is to fully pass through the tariff, and so that the incidence is on US consumers in the end, assuming that the importer also passes it on. The importer has the option to absorb some of it. Some of you might remember Trump ranting about how Walmart should eat the tariff, right? And if they did that, then the tariff would be a tax on, would be a corporate tax rather than a sales tax on consumers. So the distributional impacts, the impacts of inequality, will be subdued if this happens. But usually it's in the full pass-through scenario, it's passed on to consumers and consumers pay the tariff. The international evidence on pass-through of tariffs and exchange rates tends to support the case that for most products, there's full pass-through in the long run. And I think usually this happens where there's some market power, there's not that much domestic competition. The US is the largest consumer market in the world. So for some products, there could be less than full pass-through, which is the second option, right? Now, with the second option, the first point to make is that incomplete pass-through or partial absorption of the tariffs is quite common in the short run, right? You have pre-tariff inventories that you might have stockpiled, especially in this case where we've known for quite some time that Trump is going to raise the tariffs, and then he paused them, of course, for 90 days. So people were rushing to build up inventories before the tariff applied. So there are lags and it can take a while. But if pass-through is incomplete because of stockpiling, then there's no benefit really to US consumers. If the tariff is applicable and there's some absorption of the tariff, then there's a welfare improvement to the US because there's a terms of trade gain, right? This is the so-called optimal tariff argument. Exporters reduce their profit margins. Foreigners do indeed end up paying some or all of the tariff. This is what Trump believes always happens, right? But it doesn't. But it can for some products. We saw it happen with Chinese steel during Trump 1.0, right? So for some products, under special circumstances, it can happen. We know that China does subsidize a lot of its steel production, so they're in a position to actually absorb some of the tariffs. So if it gets absorbed in the long run, then foreigners pay the tariff, the US gains in welfare, but by and large, this happens only in special cases rather than most of the time. And Chinese steel is the exception that proves.
I lost audio. I think maybe there's been another power outage. Can somebody check with Jayant? Dr. Tung Bui, maybe we can prepare for the next presentation until we get Jayant's internet working again.
I'm ready whenever you can let me share the screen.
Okay, I think in the interest of time, we should go ahead because I really want to get to the discussion portion. We've already received some questions, and I really want to have the conversation across you speakers. So why don't we turn the floor over to you? If you have materials, please share your screen. Okay, you're already on it. Excellent. Can you put it into presentation mode? And then we can get started.
If you don't mind, I like to keep it that way so that I follow what I'm going to say.
Okay, no problem.
You
Go
can
ahead.
see this good enough, right? So
Yes, thank you.
good afternoon, good morning to everyone. It's such a pleasure for me to be back to this platform again. Thank you, the Center, for having me back. Since that famous Liberation Day on April the 2nd of this year, as a faculty member in the business school, I have been asked all the time, what are the impacts on our business? And then as I also sit on a couple of board of directors of Vietnamese companies exporting quite a bit to the US, that issue is actually haunting us all the time. And we have devised quite a few strategies to deal with this situation. So I also thank the first two speakers to lay the foundation for my talk today. Thank you so much for all the data that is very informative. So as the last panel, I would like to do something a little bit different. I would like to put everything in perspective and to have a future forward looking about the situation. So, and I am also the only US-based scholar in the panel today. So allow me to possibly put the whole tariff thing from a US perspective and then and move slowly back to the Asian countries. Again, one thing that is actually quite interesting here is that despite the fact that we are talking about international trade, the tariff situation is basically, and interestingly, a domestic business, mostly to me. We have partisan elections, populism, reshoring, rebirth of the industrial policy. That is basically driving the Trump policy as opposed to a real concern about international trade. And we've been talking about this all the time, despite the fact that we are talking about Southeast Asia and ASEAN. The China thing is always haunting us. Everything basically converges back to China and China and China again. So as far as Southeast Asia is concerned, my understanding is that Washington policy, basically, generally speaking, seems to be more positive to Southeast Asia. They are basically targeting China and try to look for Southeast Asia as possible partner. So sometimes it benefits us, sometimes it could be a collateral situation as well. So since that famous April Liberation Day, I think the most interesting lessons that we have learned from the business perspective is basically, again, the reshaping of the global supply chain. And I will talk to you a little bit about it later on. Even from the American perspective, the idea of reshoring, bringing factories back to China, to the US is very tricky. It's basically easier said than done. And then now if we have immigration policy on illegal immigration in the US, there was 2 days ago a report from the Mexican American Council. They have a very powerful report arguing that without Mexican labor, it would be almost impossible to revive the manufacturing sector in the US. And then again, even if we are focusing on Southeast Asia, it is impossible to do that without consideration of other Asian nations, in particular China, Japan, and Korea as well. So again, let me put the concept of tariffs in context. We've been focusing so much about the percentage of negotiation in terms of how much we can reduce from the initial tariff. The Vietnamese, for example, was very happy that they could negotiate from 46% down to 20%, but then they were disappointed that Thailand got 19 as opposed to 20. So again, it is actually an interesting game that we are playing here. But then, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, this is not just about trade. It is not just about bilateral trade. It is not just about global trade, but it is part of the geopolitical strategy. So national security is becoming an issue that we all know. Nationalism is becoming another issue. And as I mentioned, China is always in the background of the whole thing that is happening right now with the US. So as far as ASEAN is concerned, I think generally speaking, ASEAN is benefiting in it, but also that it is also a potential collateral about this. And Vietnam is a typical case. Vietnam has been able to take advantage of the China plus one, but on the other, as far as relocating production factories to Vietnam, but also being charged as a venue for China to reroute their supply chain network. But then another important factor that I would like to share with the audience today is that despite the fact that in the US right now, there is a huge bipartisan debate between the Democrats and the Republicans, as evidenced by the government shutdown today. But then there is indeed a growing partisan convergence in the US on tariff as part of the renewal of the industrial policy in the US, again, trying to target China. But something that is actually to me very, very important here is that this trend is going to be affecting long-term the structure of the global economy as opposed to a temporary, as many people wish that in 3 years, situation would change. So what are the consequences from the American perspective? Obviously, this is to me again, the primary motivation is American domestic policy, but then as you all know, it has major global effects. So again, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, the American supply chain realignment has benefited Vietnam, Malaysia, Thailand quite a bit. But then people outside ASEAN, India and Mexico also have been a major benefactor of the situation. As far as the two speakers mentioned it a bit earlier, especially from Jay, consumers are likely going to be the major victims of the situation. We expect inflation. I know why inflation is still relatively modest in the States, not as high as expected, but we will be talking about this during the Q&A session. And in ASEAN, probably, at least for Vietnam, which I know the case a little bit better, I think the middle class is going to be probably one of the key people affected by the situation. So another remark that I would like to share today is the internal dynamics of ASEAN. All the ASEAN leaders try to portray that ASEAN is a one unique bloc, but in fact, the unity is often challenged by national interests. You can see during the bilateral negotiation with the US, there are under the table negotiation. Basically, it could harm each other members of the ASEAN bloc. Because of the different natures of import and exports that Hera mentioned a little bit earlier in the session today. Social implications, again, to me, the most interesting, the most striking thing that we should remember today is that the consequence affects all the parties, not just the target. So the US is playing actually a pretty dangerous game. They are trying to give a hard time to their partners, but then they are also potentially being hit again by themselves. So it could equally shooting on their own foot. So we talked a little bit about, Hera mentioned a little bit about recommendations of action in her last slide. So I have one here as well. What I have here on the right-hand side of the slide is pretty much well known and advocated by the media, by the economists all over the world, diversifying the market and industries, going to other countries beyond the US, coordinate regionally, invest in human capital and digital integration, and build resilience beyond short-term shocks. So, but again, what I put on the left-hand side of my slide is that it is much easier said than done. Even for the US, relocating factories is not easy. Finding experts is not easy either. You heard the story about Hyundai and LG recently, and you heard about the difficulty by Apple of moving some of its factories from Vietnam back to the US. It's not easy at all. But I would like to call your attention on the green box on the bottom right of the screen. I think discussing about the future under the tariff war should be not complete if we are talking about the three factors that I put on the right-hand side. The major problem is the concept of uncertainty that is currently happening in the whole situation. Business, as you all know, hate uncertainty because they can't make plan. And then, as you might have heard in the news yesterday, Vietnam is having a major typhoon, and it has caused quite a bit of damage to the economy. And then, the last but not least, basically, there is a big elephant in the room: the rapid deployment of artificial intelligence. that would basically change the whole game in the situation. When I was advising the Vietnamese company, we've been talking about strategies to absorb the hike in tariff by adding more value, by increasing more productivity, or even by devaluating the Vietnamese dollar. But then there is only that much we can do. But then, as last but not least, as a warning about what is going to happen, in addition to the tariff war that we are witnessing right now, we will be soon seeing a strategy of devaluating the US dollars, basically to make export export of Chinese product, American product cheaper, and also to make import of foreign products to the US more expensive. And then if it's not enough for the Trump administration, we might soon see increasing export control and restrictions. So it's just the beginning of the situation, and I expect to see a lot of actions that is happening in the near future. So last conclusion is that the challenge for ASEAN, to back up what Hira mentioned a little bit earlier, is that how can we turn the turbulence into strategic advantage for Asian countries? Thank you so much.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Fascinating presentation. Really provocative and timely for the geopolitical issues that are evolving around trade policy. Okay, I think this is actually working really well. Jayant, you're back, and your presentation scaffolded through the other presentations, so it's kind of an interesting approach to doing this. But bring us home, and then we'll have a good discussion at the end.
Yes, thank you so much for your tolerance and your patience and for turning it into a positive. Yeah, I planned all this, of course. Yes. No, but third time lucky, I'm hoping, or not three strikes and I'm out. But I was listening to Bui, and I think, yeah, a lot of the things that I'm saying links in with what he has just presented. I'll try and highlight those as I go through quickly to finish up. I think this is where I was, which is reconfiguring supply chains, which he also just touched on. I think I was talking about how a lot of it happened during the China-only tariffs with Trump 1.0. Vietnam and several other Southeast Asian countries were major beneficiaries, including Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore. Of course, it's a bit different this time around. Then it was just China being targeted. Now everyone is being targeted. But it's the differences in tariff rates that matter now. And those differences can be significant. And if they are substantial enough, then some reconfiguration might make sense. And we'll have to wait and see whether that's indeed the case. The other option, of course, and we also mentioned this, is for firms to get behind the tariff wall and relocate. This is what President Trump is also keen on. He's often raised this, and so has Secretary Lutnick and the rest of the team, that, if you come to the US and produce here, you face no tariffs. And whether this is going to be profitable or feasible, we will have to see. It will vary again by product, and it will take time. For a lot of Southeast Asia, their supply chains are complex. They're China-centered. There's multi-country nodes. You can't simply lift them up and then move them easily or cheaply. So it's easier said than done. And in the unusual event that this does happen, there will be a lot of fixed costs associated with liquidating and then reset up. And there's also be an ongoing increase in variable costs because you're no longer producing in the site of preferred choice. You're shifting because of a distortion, which is the tariff. So by definition, your costs are likely to be higher as a result. Whether it justifies a shift is the big question. In most cases, I don't think it will. Some firms, Hyundai and Honda, have said they may shift some of it from Mexico to the US. We don't know how much they will shift, and how there have been a lot of promises. We'll have to see how much of them materialize in investment plans. This is also true for electronics, right? Where TSMC and others, NVIDIA, have promised huge investments. Whether they materialize is a different issue. It's a wait and see issue. Now, finally, the last option, of course, and Hera highlighted this, but so did is diversifying markets, right? Reducing country-level dependence on the US. We've seen how dependent they are in most cases in Southeast Asia on the US market. But again, there's a product and time dimension. Finding an alternative market may be easier for some products compared to others. Whatever the case, there'll be a host of switching costs, including search, testing, marketing, and so on. But if we just have a look at, let me just try and, if you look at, again, the relativities here on dependence of the different ASEAN countries on the US, you can see that, again, Cambodia and Vietnam are the ones that, as a share of their total exports, have a huge dependence on the US. And many other countries have huge dependence on China. So it varies by country, but also by product. So when we say reduce overall dependence by country, there must be a product dimension. Probably it's going to be something like, you don't reduce your amount of every product, but some products shift, some don't. I think that's how it might play out. Okay, so those are the four options, right? Just quickly again, full pass-through of the tariff. I think this is probably the most likely. We're already seeing that, actually, even in the short run. The producer price index last month jumped by the highest amount in 3 years, right? So there are inflationary pressures already emerging. So I think the full pass-through will be the most likely outcome, but it won't be always the case. There'll be some products where there's some absorption, certainly in the short run, but maybe even the long run. But this, again, is the exception that proves the rule of full pass-through. So, this will be a huge tax on domestic consumers. There'll be some reconfiguration and a little bit of relocation, maybe, but not much. And finally, I think the diversifying will be a long-run trend. It won't happen immediately, but slowly but surely, countries will be looking to reduce their reliance on a seemingly unpredictable trade partner, right? And an aggressive trade partner that's turning inward and isolationist, right? And these are some of those effects. We have to deal with permanently higher tariffs on everyone. We have the universal tariff of 10%. Then we have a new version of the bad tariff. China-only tariffs have been carried over from Trump 1.0, and we don't know what will happen when negotiations conclude. This is the one country that's still outstanding and is very important for Southeast Asia, right? As I mentioned, Southeast Asian supply chains are China-centered and will remain China-centered. And then there's all these new sectoral tariffs. Just this week, or was it last week? We heard about the new tariffs on pharmaceuticals, on trucks, on furniture, forestry goods. This is never ending, right? Now it's also on foreign-made films and what's next. So this is an ongoing saga. And I think, this is the concern. And on that point, I think what we will see a year or so down the track is that these tariffs will not do what they're intended to do, which is to narrow bilateral deficits, right? Bilateral deficits might narrow if the US falls into recession, but that's not a good outcome. That's not the way to reduce your deficit. But the tariffs themselves won't have a big impact. If that's the case, will we see another round of more tariffs? We know that Trump loves tariffs. He repeats that frequently. So I think that is the concern. We are already seeing rising inflation. We've seen some labor markets softening in the US. So the risk of stagflation is increasing. It's not certain, but it's increasing. But the global recession we all feared, the repeat of the 1930s, looks increasingly unlikely, which is good news. But some damage has already been done. The uncertainty has shelved a lot of investment plans, and there have been layoffs in Southeast Asia because in the short run, there'll be huge adjustment costs as we try to reduce dependence on the US market and we lose market share, right? But I think
Jayant, I just want to jump in. We're running close on time. I want to have time for discussion. I see we're coming up on the last slide. Just wanted to jump in.
Okay, give me 2 more minutes and I'll wrap up. I think it's important that Southeast Asian countries do not retaliate, remain open and outward looking. And these will be particularly important given the dominance of global supply chains. Longer term impacts very quickly. I think the US has lost a lot of goodwill that is built up over decades, the so-called 80 years lost in just 80 days. And it's now increasingly being seen as an unreliable, even hostile trade partner. And I think it's distracted from the real issue of dealing with non-tariff barriers everywhere, including in China, right? I mean, this focus on new tariffs has shifted that attention, and that's a pity. And this won't be the way to get China to reduce their non-tariff barriers, I don't think. There's also an increase in concerns over corruption and cronyism, doing deals, using trade for foreign policy objectives, as you've seen with Brazil, for instance, or India. And I think for Southeast Asia, the US is an important market, but it's probably less important than it may appear. And this is the real versus financial distinction. It's less than 15% of world trade, 8% for exports and about 12% for imports. But we often think of the US in terms of its role financially, right? It's 70% of market capitalization, and the stock market, of course, is critical. Finally, I think a longer-term concern is the role of the US dollar. The US dollar isn't going to go away anytime soon, mostly because there's no real alternative yet. But over time, it could lose its significance. And I think it won't change anytime soon, but this is something that it's slowly losing its significance because of what's been happening. So thank you very much. Let me stop there. And again, my apologies for the interruptions, but look forward to the discussion. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Thanks so much. Fascinating. Amazing set of presentations. Really, expands the thinking in overall trying to make sense of this moment, contextualizing economic and trade issues relative to ASEAN, the US, and even globally. It was really nice to see these perspectives that were situated globally, Jayant, with the US perspective from Tung and a very ASEAN regional perspective from Hera. And I think that sets us up for a really nice Q&A and discussion section for the next 15 minutes. I want to make an announcement first. There's been some questions from the attendees about access to this presentation. This will be available online in the future. And we do, our webinar series does get a lot of traffic after the presentation. So we'll make sure that if you're in attendance today, you'll have access to the materials. Second is I want to first allow an opportunity to have a discussion across the panelists. So it'd be really interesting because you're kind of talking about similar issues to get questions across each of you. So if somebody wants to start us off on something, please go ahead. Otherwise, I have some questions or I can take it over to the attendees' questions right away. Any thoughts?
No, go ahead. Go ahead with your questions.
Okay, we have a question from Ben Kirkfleet. Are some Southeast Asia states challenging the national and/or international legality of Trump's tariffs? I know, Tung, you responded a little bit in the chat, but please, anybody, go ahead. What's your perspective on this point?
To my knowledge, I don't know any country that has been trying to challenge the US. This is just basically a asymmetric power game. So David versus Korea. So I think it is a little bit difficult to fight. And as Jay mentioned a little bit earlier, his recommendation is not to retaliate or to fight, but to cooperate. So I guess the Vietnam and the UK was the very first two countries who got into the negotiation table in the very first hours of the announcement. So I think that turned out to be actually a pretty smart game.
Yes, can I jump in, Micah? Yeah, echo what we just said. I think so far we've seen countries pandering, right? Trying to appease Trump, trying to ensure that the tariffs are reduced, and they have been to some extent. And so they see that as having value because the US is a very important market. They are concerned about, the level of these tariffs. So there's been no challenge. And also it's difficult to challenge because, the US has paralyzed the appellate body in the WTO. And so the dispute settlement mechanism is not really working terribly well. They're not retaliating, and I think that's the right approach. And because tariffs, in my view, harm the country imposing them more so than any other country. So that's not the way to proceed. There is the MPIA, the alternative to the appellate system, which is arbitration. But that's growing in significance, but the US is not a member. And I don't think the US will join, because, they claim, overreach in the WTO, and this is not going to be something that they find, serving their interests. So no, they're not challenging it for now. If I think this continues and they see that there's nothing to be gained by concessions, that might change, but not for now.
Yeah, if I might jump in. So instead
Please.
of challenging the tariff from the US, I think some country, let's say, for example, Indonesia, we even like to get the tariff to reduce from 32% to 19%, we have this kind of intense negotiation. And at the end of the day, like Indonesia offer to purchase like energy products from the US, and then like commitment to do like to import like billion in agriculture product and so on. So in this term, I think ASEAN countries still want to kind of protect their their kind of export to the US. Yeah, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Yeah, on that point, if I may, Micah, yeah, I think that's a very important point that Hera has mentioned. This was also, looking at the silver lining. This was an opportunity for many countries to deal with some of the non-tariff barriers, right? Not just in Southeast Asia, but say in India, for instance, where barriers are very high. And some of these concessions were good outcomes, right, from this whole process. But the kinds of things that some countries have promised, that Hera has mentioned, the promise to buy certain amounts of agricultural products, energy products, these are effectively quotas, right? So you agree to buy X amount at a fixed price, and this is another form of protection. In fact, it's a horrible form of protection, because quotas, when they're binding, have an effective rate of infinity, right? Effective rate of protection. So that's not a good outcome. Reducing barriers is a silver lining, right, in response to these tariffs. But agreeing to buy as a bribe, X amount of soybeans or whatever, is actually adding to the protectionism rather than improving welfare. Yeah.
Excellent. Tung, you wanna add something?
Yes, actually, talking about challenge, my recommendation, which is basically to very classical recommendation from economists, is that what we are seeing is that Trump is truly putting institutional disequilibrium. So what other countries should be doing, ASEAN, for example, as a whole bloc, maybe teaming up with other associations in order to restore the institution equilibrium, basically restoring the WTO. I think that would be the best optimal situation, at least from a theoretical perspective. So instead of challenging the United States on a bilateral platform, I think a better way is to restore some form of institution, which is like WTO, in order to have a more stable global trade.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think we've talked a lot about the bilateral or just like the regional perspective. But the role of these international institutions, the intermediaries, the banks, and all those things. Does anybody want to comment on that element of this as well? Or let me raise some other questions that I think have come up throughout. Hera, you talked a lot about labor and commodities, and the figures that you put up of the differentiation between each of the countries. I found that really interesting. Can you talk a little bit more about what the implications for ASEAN countries on the shifts of labor might be? And so you touched on the issues related to Vietnam in particular, and the role of generative AI in transforming sort of the labor and economic conditions of Vietnam. Can we start off a conversation on those two potential topics? Hera, you want to go first?
Yeah, if we see the export by product category from Vietnam, we can see like there are many, I think more than 50%. It's from the clothing and textile, which if we see, it's like a labor intensive kind of product. And then what happened? Well, we still say if, because like even the data is not available for the fairly recent data, but based on the 2024 data, it means that any decline in the production of the this labor kind of intensive product. Let's say if the Trump tariff kind of reduce the demand for this product, it will subsequently decrease the kind of the labor use in that kind of production. And then what will happen, of course, like many people will kind of lose the job. And then and then it means that like lower productivity and then lower production of the product, and then people will lose the job, and then the poverty will also be there. And then in terms of labor production intensive product in ASEAN, there are so many informal workers and also women that can also affected by this kind of tariff if the export from the US kind of reduce, and then we don't have any more like other kind of market to sell the product. Yeah, that's how I see it in terms of the labor intensive product to this kind of the decline in the labor kind of demand in Vietnam per se. Yeah, I'll stop there. Maybe there's like some more answer for other panelists.
Go ahead, Tung, if you want to.
Yes, actually, when I did this presentation back in July in Ho Chi Minh City to a group of entrepreneurs, basically they were, at that time, it was only 2 days after the outcome of the negotiation coming down from 46% to 20%. I was expecting that Vietnamese business people would whine quite a bit about the situation, but in fact they were quite happy. So yeah, I was joking that maybe you master the art of hiding your fear, but in fact what they are telling me is that now if they indeed they have to be paying 20% tax, they will try to do the best they can. So they started to negotiate with labor unions in order to increase productivity primarily. They also try to negotiate with their clients like Costco and Walmart and whatever in order to share the cost of the tariff hike. So they are trying to do something about it. And they are also trying to increase productivity. And this is where I mentioned about AI. Vietnam actually, adoption of AI in production is increasing to a speed that actually amazes me quite a bit. So those are, again, those factors that are basically hiding behind just the tariff war. And then the Trump administration actually has been accusing the Vietnamese to devaluate the Vietnamese money against the dollar. And then, so this is basically a lot of dynamics that is happening. So again, my recommendation to Vietnamese business is that, as Jay mentioned it a bit earlier, to look at a long-term perspective as opposed to play cat and mouse catching game in the short term.
Yeah. If I
Okay.
can just quick.
Yes,
Yeah,
please. I want to give you another opportunity to respond, but we're coming up on time, so I want to give each of you just 30 seconds to give some final remarks. But we've jumped around from really complex issues, from labor to commodities to tariffs to geopolitics to all of these things. So given the complexities, please feel free to comment, Jay, and then let's have some very brief closing remarks to finalize this webinar.
Yeah, sure. Just very quickly, I think, and this can also, serve as my final remarks, if you like, is the problem with this whole tariff policy, as I see it, is that there's no selectivity, right? There's no product focus. I mean, what are you trying to reshore here, if that's indeed the case? Everything? Do you want to reshore textiles and clothing? I mean, these are the kinds of things you should be importing, right? The US does a great job in exporting so many sophisticated services and also some manufactured products in the higher end category, right? There's no need to try and reshore things that it stopped doing for good reasons because it's moved up the value chain. So there needs to be a bit more selectivity if you must pursue this type of industrial policy. And this has been highlighted in the case of Southeast Asia, where by and large, most countries still export labor-intensive content in their manufactured goods. And now they are being penalized, but the cost will also be borne by US consumers.
Excellent. Very, very interesting. Great contextualization to summarize sort of the discussion here. Hera, do you want to give us your final remark?
Oh yeah, thank you for the opportunity. And yeah, actually, like before I give my final remarks, actually the magnitude of this tariff and the impact, it's not only the labor that work on that product, but if we try to see the labor content export, they call it. I try to find like the latest kind of data, but I'm unable to provide it here. But it's the magnitude of this, let's say, potential impact on tariff will be like bigger than what we expected. And then in conclusion, I think ASEAN trade with the US is both opportunity and vulnerability. I mean, the concentration of export in few key sectors in ASEAN is uneven. And then it's also create significant risk under reciprocal tariff pressure. So I think this is the like wake up call for ASEAN to kind of start diversify the product, even though it's like costly and things like that. But in the long term, I think we need to do that and then do the collective action for like to get like more benefit from the negotiation and also like do like some strategies with the that can focus on the workers and then things like that. So I think I'll stop that.
Excellent points. Tung, any final thoughts? Please. Yeah,
I just
thanks.
want to say that I concur with Jay and Hera about the concluding remarks. I couldn't agree more. So I just want to say that even if nobody is comfortable with the current situation, but then if we are thinking a little bit more deeply, I think what is happening right now is kind of inevitable. Is kind of inevitable. Globalization has been around for decades, and that the world has been changing quite a bit. So it is time for us to adapt to the new situation. And then this is basically, as Hera just mentioned a little bit earlier, this is an opportunity of taking this challenge into opportunities by moving forward with new technology, with new productivity, with more innovative service and products. And I think this is the way that we should move forward and not spending too much time debating on tariffs and negotiation on tariffs. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much. Really prescient words and really thoughtful reflections. Great that we came to some sort of common ground at the end. I think there's much more room for debate on these issues, and I really appreciate you all taking the time to do this. It's been really, really wonderful to hear from each of you on such an important global topic. I'm going to turn it back to the Center for Southeast Asian Studies to wrap up our show for today. Thank you so much. Aloha.
I just
wanted to say on behalf of the entire Center for Southeast Asian Studies, we are grateful for people who have participated in this webinar, and for everyone who's listening. It's been enlightening. It's sobering, but in typical Southeast Asian style, it's also uplifting at the end. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, everyone. Nice to see you again, Jayant.
Yes, same here. And so sorry for all the glitches, the technology. My gosh.
Good now, Mike. We have a safe flight.
Thank you so much. Yes, I better
Thank
rush
you so
off.
much, Dr. Micah
Bye.
and Dr. Tung. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Have a good day.